Welcome in. If you're an artificial intelligence student or professional, and if you're looking forward to having a long, happy, and we certainly hope lucrative career in not just artificial intelligence as we know it now, but artificial general intelligence, which is not yet on the scene, but it's like objects in the rearview mirror. They're closer than you think. So here's the thing. It's absolutely essential to start building now a very solid foundation of your understanding of those key elements that are most likely to contribute to the AGI that will be emerging very, very soon. Now, if you were with me a couple of videos ago, 2 videos ago, we went through the 3 main contenders of contributing. These aren't going to be the solo winners. It's not going to be, this is our architecture and everything else falls away along the road, so to speak, but rather all 3 things are liable to be contributing components. And those were the transformer-based, the LLM contributions, which we've already identified as having limited ability on their own to be significant AGI contenders, artificial general intelligence contenders, although they can certainly play a role. Okay. We'll get to that later. Then we had LeCun's architecture, which included JEPA, Joint Embedding Predictive Architecture, JEPA, and of course hierarchical JEPAs. And then on that far left, for you to be over here, on the far left of the image that I was showing 2 vids ago, we were looking at an architecture or a concept evolved predominantly by Friston, and then there are others who are coming in and offering perspectives and taking things a little bit further. So here's where we are. We need, this is you, me, all of us as a community, we need, if we're going to be at all functional in the emerging world of AGI, to be able to do the contrast and compare between these different proponents for leading methods. And let's just assume, let's just take it as our operating principle for right now, that the likely evolution is that all 3 will be involved. So it's not like we're going to use Jan LeCun's 8 GPA, hierarchical JEPA, and we'll let Friston's work fall to the side, or use his and not LeCun's. They could very possibly coexist in the same architecture. Possibility. We don't know yet, which is why we need to be able to do that contrast and compare kind of thing. Similarly, we need to know how they relate, both of those methods, to transformer-based architectures. What's the core nature, the difference, the fundamentals for that contrast and compare, because we want to put things appropriately into the evolving AGI architectures. That means understanding the strengths and the limitations, the weaknesses, the capabilities of each, what we can get them to do, even with all sorts of massive tweaking, the way they were attempting to do right now with LLMs, and what it is that we just need some different approaches, because otherwise we're trying to like force a hammer to do the job of a drill. So here we are. First of all, I'm going to invite you to pause, hit the description box below, click on a link to a blog post. And the reason is this. Every single vid that I'm putting out, there are a few minor exceptions, but I'm trying really hard to make sure that all these vids connect to a blog post. The blog post is your link. It's sort of like the spinal column with nerves leading out. It's your link to all the associated resources. So there are resources for this vid. And when I speak about a video that was 1 or 2 vids ago, I will link in there to the YouTube. So what you'll see as this vid progresses, as all of our vids progress, I'm giving you the visual nomenclature. I will show you the thumbnail for the vid that I'm referencing, the YouTube that I'm referencing. Then when you go to the blog post, look for that thumbnail, and you'll see it as actually the video link. Click on that. It will take you to its own blog post, of course, its own description box. But I will also, in the blog post, link to prior related blog posts, so you'll look for them. I'll try to make clear which YouTube vid the previous blog posts are associated with, so you can match things up accordingly. We had a little bit of a wind going on in the background, so I'm doing a voiceover. Now, in that previous vid, which was 2 vids ago, we addressed or identified 3 things that form the essential nexus of what we believe can lead to AGI. And those three things are, of course, LeCun's work on JEPA, Joint Embedding Predictive Architecture, also including hierarchical JEPA. Then Friston's work on active inference, which has led to Hafner and colleagues in 2022 evolving the next step of Action Perception Divergence, which is really the same notion but taken to a next logical place. And then a brief nod towards transformer-based architectures, which are really not going to be the focus of our discussion because we know their limitations. We've got a lot of documentation there. We've got plenty of materials for teaching ourselves about transformers, so we're not going to focus on them extensively, just in the sense of having a little tiny bit of contrast and compare for completeness. And I link in that first vid to the blog post, and then the vid right after, the one just before this, to its own blog post, to 5 key papers. So we've got an Action Perception Divergence paper. I think I linked to Carl Friston's earlier works, I'm sure that I did, 2013, 2015, treating them almost as one. We linked to Jan LeCun's work on JEPA and its architecture that uses it, and then a 2024 architecture that builds on that. So the resources that you want are all to hand right there, and nicely formatted Chicago style in case you're a student and you want to swipe references. Alrighty. All that we're doing today in this vid, which is very short, is we're setting context. We're doing the stage up for contrast and compare. So let me give you the first key element, and that is that comparison between world model architectures, which include both JEPA and Action Perception Divergence, or APD. So we're looking at a comparison between world model architectures and the transformer-based architectures. And the reason that I'm pulling this up is that there's a recent blog post by, I'm going to have to take a deep breath and say this, Ignacio de Gregorio Noblias. Does beautiful work, and I will of course link to it in the blog post below. So he's one of my favorite tech bloggers, always does a magnificent job. So I'm going to show you right here a tech blog produced comparing the JEPA to the transformers, and with a minor quibble, and that is this. I'm going to suggest that the first and most elementary comparison to make is not JEPA or Action Perception Divergence with the transformers, but the JEPA and the Action Divergence with each other. And the reasons that those are both goal-seeking mechanisms. Those are both, how do you represent a world? So there's the world itself, there's the representation of that world, and then there's the model of the representation, not the model of the world, the model of the representation of the world. Profound and useful distinction, believe me, very, very important. And you'll see that as you take a look at both the pictures advanced by Friston, like over a decade ago, and LeCun in his recent paper. You'll see that they make a real distinction between the world, which is out there someplace, the representation of the world model, and within that, they don't all, well, LeCun didn't quite make it explicit in his drawing, but it's implicit. Friston, of course, has always been explicit about this, but there's the representation of the world, and then there's a model of the representation, and you are trying to bring the model close to the representation. Now, if you're over in the Action Perception Divergence end of things, that's the essence of the whole argument, is that you are trying to bring a model close to a representation. It's a little bit more subdued, it's a bit more implicit in the writing by LeCun, but as you get into it, it'll be very clear that what you're trying to do in both cases is not just represent the world, but as the world changes, or as we, as some sort of system moving in the world, change our perspective, then we need to update our representation of the world, of course, and then update the model accordingly to keep that model close to the representation. And if you're over in Action Perception Divergence, or even the earlier active inference work, or even if you're tracing your thoughts all the way back to variational inference, that means Kullback-Leibler divergence. If you go over into LeCun's work, slightly different origin story, but a similar tone and theme. You're trying to model a representation. Now, important point number one. The key thing in LeCun's work, there are several key points that LeCun makes early. We're not going to go into all of them, just picking up a few because we're trying to grab those threads of thought that we want to put in the back of our heads as we're going forward and setting up in our minds to do this contrast and compare. Number one, you'll see that LeCun talks about the necessity for differentiable elements in that model of the representation of the world. Differentiable elements. You need differentiable elements when you're doing a control system. Okay, everybody just do a breathe, release, line up with me here energetically. Let me do a very quick aside. The focus here in these talks with you, they're sort of like public lectures with steady notes on the side, those are the blog posts, okay? Is I'm not going to try to go through massive derivations here with you. This isn't a point-by-point tutorial. It's more how we can share intuition and insight. And there'll be moments like this one where the thing to do is for our minds to sort of do an at, I know this is sort of funny, but an at-distance Vulcan mind meld, if you will. Sort of bring your mind into resonance with mine so that as I express a concept to you, you can wrap your heads around it very easily and with minimal fuss, bother, and expenditure of your precious time. You get it. You get it at that not just like superficial floaty out there sense, but you get it all the way down into that gut. I have internalized this. This is part of my who I am and understanding this sense. It shaves anything from hours and days to weeks, months, years off your study if you can internalize this stuff. And one of my primary objectives in having these little discussions with you is that your assimilation time, the time that it takes for you to truly internalize a crucial concept is cut to the absolute minimum, and yet you still get the wholeness of the insight. So when it comes to LeCun using a word like differentiable, that's a key word that should trigger all sorts of stuff in ourself that brings up everything that we know about control theory. Because he's talking about how are you going to adjust model parameters to bring the model close to the representation and move it forward over time. It's a control theory kind of thinking. Similarly, if you go over to Action Perception Divergence, the whole tone of that is about how do you keep updating the model so that it stays close to your representation over time. Those two things have a very similar ethos, if you will. They have a purpose or raison d'etre. In contrast, anything transformer-based is, by its very nature, just a generate the next thing. Generate, 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 generate. Transformers, the ultimate example of a generative architecture. There's three key elements, okay? Anytime you say generative, it's important that we bring up mentally these three elements. Number one, Kullback-Leibler. You're always, in any generative model, you're going to be doing an actual reverse Kullback-Leibler. You're going to be bringing a model close to data. Secondly, you're going to be doing a conditional probability. The latent depends on the observed. All right, that is heart, soul, core essence of generative. And then third, the actual minimization method that you're evoking is going to be based on statistical thermodynamics or mechanics, stat mech for short. Those three things, bum, 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 they are always present anytime you say the word generative. Central to that line of thinking, of course, being that conditional probability. So you go over and take a look at Jan LeCun's thinking, and it's like he makes it very, very, very clear. This is not a generative model. Oh, that's interesting. You go over to Friston's work, and then also to Hafner et al., building on that early Friston work. And they make it very clear, this is generative. So when you take a look at the equations, you're going to see conditional dependence. You're going to see the latent variables depend on the observed. That's how that system is constructed. You take a look at LeCun's, and the latent variable is separated out from the observables, I have to say I'm still wrapping my head around that. It's like, oh my God, if you don't get your latent variables from your observed, where do they come from? What are they dependent on? Like, how do you build that? I'm still warping my head around that notion, okay? So I'll be back with you on that as time goes on. But that is a key difference. That's a key distinction. It's a delineation between LeCun's work, which in your seeing the image, it's up in your right-hand corner. I was just holding out my left hand there. Up in your right-hand corner, we're seeing the LeCun, the architecture based on the JEPA. If you're in Friston's world, or the Hafner building on Friston world, it's generative. If you go down to transformers, it's generative. It's conditional probability based. So those are two interesting things. The number one is the appropriate comparison is, here we go, LeCun architecture in your upper right with the Friston architecture in your upper left. And those two are both ultimately contributing to control systems. You will be looking there for model parameters that would potentially influence how the model is adapted over the future, and it should be dynamically adapted because the idea is to progress forward through time, versus the transformers, which are generative, but they are encoder decoder. So once it's encoded, all you're going to do is generate or decode the next element in a string, then the next and the next and the next, and it doesn't matter how many rags. And let me just take a deep breath on this one. Reinforcement learning with human feedback, RLHF. You put on top of that, the core algorithm is still the same. So, proper points of comparison, LeCun and Friston. If you're trying to compare LeCun, let me use this, LeCun with transformers is like comparing apples with potatoes, even though the French may call the potato a pomme de terre, a earth apple. A potato is not a good point of comparison with an apple. But if you're going to do comparisons of fruit, you can do a apple against an orange. That would be a LeCun versus a Friston-based model, and make sense of that comparison. So, okay, we've got two thoughts out of today, and they may guide your perspective as you start delving into these papers. So, once again, 5 papers. Even if you're not reading them, make sure that you go to that blog post from the original blog post that was 2 vids ago and get the 5 core papers, and then several other papers that are supporting them. You want these all in your library. You want to at least be scanning title, authors, dates done, of course, just to get a sense of the order of things. The abstract, the intro, get a sense, read as far as you're comfortable. We will be going through certain equations, lightly, gently, in a way that is easiest for all of us. Today, though, we just set up our context for this comparison of elements study. So before we close, let's give ourselves a brief recap not only of what we've learned in this vid, but in the 2 prior vids, as this is 3rd in a series. So in that first vid, titled AGI, The Coming AGI Wars, Players and Positioning, which appeared May 15th of this year, 2024, we identified the various players. Specifically, we gathered up and did a little bit of intelligence on the LLM, or actually the overall transformer set of players. By the time we'd counted them up, there were 7 different significant contenders in the LLM area. And then we took a look at those that were using some form of obvious reinforcement and or control methods. That included LeCun with JEPA at Meta, and then comparable work being done at Google's DeepMind and of course Google Brain. Now we're positioning that versus the work coming out of Vercès, which has recently brought in Carl Friston and his ideas on active inference to support their AI development. And then as a final contribution to this landscape, we've got ideas being advanced out of our company, Themesis, specifically those involving corticons, content-retentive, temporally connected neural networks, and not to be too shy, but I really didn't say anything about them in the entire vid. Not to worry, we'll get to them later in this series, I promise. So in that first vid in this series, all that we did was identify players and establish their roles, their positions on the playing board, vis-a-vis each other. Now we know that despite magnificent performance in so many areas, the transformer-based architectures have limited utility in terms of being true AGI contenders. They can certainly be a component, but they're not going to be a full-fledged AGI. So we're going to let the transformers, metaphorically speaking, subside beneath the waves for a little while. And in vid 2, we turned our attention to the two contenders that we believe will be the primary influencers for AGI. As we got this clarity and focus, we identified 5 key papers that we believe form the essential core of our reading assignments, shall we say, for these next few months. Now in this vid, we began with that sense of clarity, and we identified also the resources that we've assembled so far so that you can be doing a self-study program on your own as we go through this. We probed just a little bit into LeCun's approach, JEPA, Joint Embedding Predictive Architecture, and identified 3 key elements. First, it's very world model centric. Both Action Perception Divergence and JEPA are oriented towards building world models as models of the representation of the observed reality. 2 other important points that we observed about the JEPA approach are not just the world model-ness of it, but then in LeCun's thinking, there's a need for these models to be differentiable. That's essential when we start thinking about world models as guiding a control systems approach. And then finally, but perhaps most essential, the JEPA approach is not generative, whereas when we look at the comparable approach, active inference morphing into Action Perception Divergence, it is generative. Now, we didn't go any further into active inference or Action Perception Divergence today, and of course there's a reason for it. The core of Action Perception Divergence, or APD, comes out of Friston's active inference, and active inference comes out of variational inference, and variational inference is very solidly built on a foundation of statistical mechanics, or stat mech. So before we can really have a good discussion of APD, we need to do a little bit of active inference and backtrack our way into variational inference and rest on that stat mech core. It's the absolute inner core of this whole approach. And the truth is, not that many people understand that. So let me introduce to you the lowest cost, the easiest, the most painless and expeditious method to get that statistical mechanics requisite background, the essential vocabulary that you need before we can take on that aspect of our study. Really, what we're talking about is getting an essential core vocabulary, just the minimalist, most basic working vocabulary that you absolutely need if you're going to be reading in any of the areas that involve variational inference, active inference, and how they are going to be contributing to artificial general intelligence. And the emphasis here is on mostly knowing what you don't need. In other words, you don't need a whole lot of fancy equations. You surely don't need a lot of derivations. There's a whole lot of statistical mechanics that you can safely ignore. So if we're teaching ourselves artificial intelligence, then it's as though learning backpropagation, CNNs, and even reinforcement learning are like going from St. Louis, Missouri, or Elm Grove as far as Fort Laramie, Wyoming. Fairly straightforward. Not that it doesn't have challenges, but straightforward. Generative AI is like getting over the mountains, and there's a couple of different Donner passes involved. These 2 different Donner passes involve different kinds of statistical thermodynamics. Same core equation, but the way that it's used and interpreted is so different, and both means are essential if you're going to understand AGI. So the reason that you fundamentally want to get a trail guide when you're crossing the Sierra Nevada mountains of artificial intelligence is that you want someone who can tell you, this is how I almost died. What you're paying for are the campfire stories. You're wanting to know how somebody narrowly avoided death by going in one direction instead of another, or they actually went in the wrong direction and nearly starved to death on the mountains. So you need a trail guide. Somebody who can show you which path to take, or if there's two different paths, how they actually relate to each other, how they connect at the end. All these important things that you'd only get by having a conversation with somebody who's gone through it and gotten lost and found again. So here's what I've done. I put together the short course. It's the top 10 terms in statistical mechanics. Let's just call that StatMech. Top 10 terms in StatMech. So I started this course simply as a vocabulary builder. I just put down the top 10 terms, things that I've already shown you. For example, partition function, free energy, terms that we need to have in our vocabulary because they show up in the papers that we're reading. And if we can get a gut sense, even a light, gentle, fairly innocuous little concept of what they're like, then we don't have that bounce away factor when we're reading the paper. We can continue and probe a little bit deeper. So that was the starting base. And I actually started this whole course more than 2 years ago, well before Transformers became such an important thing. And it turned out that it became more important than ever to add on bonus materials. For example, a 10-minute tutorial on the first paragraph alone in the now infamous Salakushinoff and Hinton 2012 paper on deep learning, or a total bonus section on how the reverse callback-Liebler differs from the regular callback-Liebler and how the reverse callback-Liebler is the one that we typically use in generative AI. We've got a section on variational inference and a section on active inference with Carl Friston's work. In short, by the time that you've completed this 21-day, gentle yet intensive immersion, you'll be able to read some papers that previously were simply off limits for you. One more word. For this July cohort, July 2024, I'm offering a great deal more one-on-one involvement. We're having weekly get-togethers, Zoom sessions, and also one-on-one phone calls where I check up on how you're doing. And the reason is that this is still an alpha level course. Maybe it's alpha beta. We've had one cohort go through successfully, but now taking you folks through, I need your feedback, and that's why I'm offering so much involvement. In later iterations of this course, you won't have nearly as much of my engagement because I'll be busy with the AGI course that we're developing now. So to sign up, go to the Themesis website, visit our Academy page. You'll see links to our course at themesis.thinkific.com. And please be sure to opt in with Themesis if you haven't done so already, because that's how we tell you when there's specials of all sorts. In particular, flash sales for the course. We've got a sale going on right now here in early July, and the price will be going up nearly daily until the course begins on Monday the 15th. So by all means, sign up as early as you can. We'll so look forward to seeing you there. Thank you. I'm Aliana Morin, founder and chief scientist with Themesis, founder of the Themesis Academy, your godmother for artificial general intelligence. And it's been lovely to have a moment with you. Thank you. We'll see you again soon. Have a great day.